Welcome to Health Outlook, the program that brings you key insights into health matters that affect Malawians. I am your host, Catherine Dindo, and today we are kicking off a special month-long series on mosquitoes and vector-borne diseases leading up to World Mosquito Day on August 20th. To start off, we are joined in the studios by Kennedy Zembere, a vector biology researcher from the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Research Program in Chikwawa, here to help us understand what vectors are and why they matter in public health. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
What are vectors in the context of health?
In the context of health, public health. So vectors, these are tiny organisms that are responsible for transmitting diseases. So actually vectors, they do carry diseases, or sometimes we just call them disease carriers, where they can get a disease from, for example, one person, and then they can transmit the same disease to another person who did not have that disease. So they are called vectors. Good example could be a mosquito, for example. When you talk about malaria, a mosquito is actually not born with malaria. It's born with a perfect body, no any disease. So once it's bitten someone that has malaria, that's when it gets the disease. And then when it has access to another person, and then it's also able to bite that other person, then it will take the disease to the other person. So that's a very good example of a vector and how it works.
Now, why are vectors like mosquitoes? You've mentioned mosquitoes.
Mm-hmm.
And can snails also be regarded as vectors?
Yes, snails could be regarded as vectors because snails are also responsible for transmitting diseases like bilharzia. Some people, we call it schistosomiasis. But yeah, I think the common one is bilharzia. So bilharzia is transmitted by snails because what happens is the parasites that cause the disease, they are actually mostly found in water. But one of the stages of their development for the parasites that are responsible for bilharzia, it's supposed to pass through the body of a snail. In other words, without the snail, that stage will not continue, and the life cycle of the parasites is going to end. They will die. So the snails work as intermediate host of those parasites. So they are part of the vectors because they are responsible of transmitting diseases from one person to another person.
What are some of the most common vector-borne diseases here in Malawi?
The most common, we have a number of vector-borne diseases in Malawi. I think the most common is malaria, as I've mentioned. We also have bilharzia as one of the vectors, vector-borne diseases in Malawi. I think those are some of the commonest. Of course, we also have what we call arboviruses. These are viral-borne diseases, but they are carried also by mosquitoes. But most of these are not that common in Malawi. Of course, they are becoming a threat, but apparently, they are not that a challenge. But we know in other countries, like also mostly maybe in America, especially southern part of America, and also some parts of Asia, we have diseases like dengue, which is a very deadly disease. It's transmitted by mosquitoes as well, especially what we call Aedes mosquitoes. Here in Africa, we have countries like Uganda, and there's a threat that eastern countries like Malawi, perhaps we may also be threatened by this kind of disease. But currently, it's not that a big problem. But because we have so many of these vectors that are responsible for transmitting dengue, it might also have a problem. It might become a problem in the near future, especially if us as researchers and also even the government, they are not taking initiatives maybe to start what we call surveillance. Because right now we may be thinking we don't have these diseases, but the problem is we are not doing any surveillance or any studies on these diseases. But the stand is we don't have them. But I believe we may have them, but just because maybe we are not able to make surveillance and also even diagnosis. So that's one of the reasons.
Now, how does the environment, as in the geographical location, contribute to the spread of these vectors?
So the environment actually plays a very significant role in the spread of vector-borne diseases. I'll start by mentioning about the presence of water, for example. Maybe you might have heard, or maybe you know that vector-borne diseases, vectors like mosquitoes, for example, most of them, they rely on the presence of water because that's where they multiply. That's their habitats. The life cycle of my mosquito, for example, it passes through several stages. One of them is they will require water. That's where mosquitoes will go and lay their eggs. And after laying the eggs, the mosquitoes will hatch what we call larvae and then pupa. From there, the adults will emerge. So you see that the very first 3 stages of a mosquito, they actually depend on water, availability of water. In other words, without water, it means that life cycle is going to be disturbed and mosquitoes might be minimized. So the presence of water, which is part of the environment, it's really one of the significant contributing factors to the spread of vector-borne diseases. Other factors like, for example, maybe humidity, even temperature also plays a very significant role. That's why in Malawi and most of the countries where malaria is endemic, where temperatures are high, we also experience increased episodes of malaria, for example. And that's why countries like those up north, they don't have so many issues with malaria. But us who are in the tropics, because most of the time the tropics are very hot, the temperature, the conditions are very conducive for proliferation of mosquitoes. So the environment is really a very key factor as far as vector-borne diseases are concerned.
Now, as an organization, what are you currently doing related to vector surveillance or control?
As MOW, we are doing several studies. We are doing a lot of work, especially related to vector surveillance and control. Of course, for now, mostly we are working much on surveillance of vectors. The current project that we are doing in Chikwawa is what we call the Shirevec. So the Shirevec is coming in following the big project under the government that maybe you know, probably we call it the Shire Valley Transformation Project. It's a very good initiative that is going to probably help farmers down in Chikwawa, especially agriculture-wise, because it's a very big agricultural irrigation project, whereby there are large canals that are being constructed currently. A canal that will run from Chikwawa up to Nsanje over close to 100 kilometers in length. So that's a very big project. So yes, that project will be very important to Malawians. It's going to help us to have bumper yields. But on the other hand, there could be possibilities that the presence of this canal would also increase the proliferation of diseases, especially vector-borne diseases. Because as I said, these vectors, they proliferate where there is water. And I should mention that these vector-borne diseases, they increase actually mostly during wet season, when we have so much rains, and when during the dry season, they actually minimized. In other words, in Chikwawa, we have a lot of cases during the rainy season. However, with the coming of this canal, it means water will be available throughout the year. So in other words, what we are doing as under Shirevec is to assess the impact of that project on disease vector proliferation. So working with the communities to see how that is going to affect them. This in the end is going to help the government, because as I said, this irrigation project is very important. It has to come. We need it. But they also need to be aware of what could be the public health impacts, so that the government may be prepared, and also the people in the community may be prepared, so that once the project starts, they should know what they should do to minimize the increase of these diseases. So that's the study that we are doing currently.
What are some of the challenges that you have encountered so far in as far as vector control in rural districts is concerned?
There are a lot of challenges that we face, especially as far as vector-borne disease control is concerned. I think one of the main challenges is what we call insecticide resistance. So currently, the gold standard method of controlling mosquitoes is the use of what we call mosquito nets. And in Malawi and most of African countries, we are recommended to be using mosquito nets. Why? Because mosquitoes, most of the time, they bite people during the night when they are sleeping. So we believe that once someone is under the mosquito net, at least it's going to help them to prevent the mosquito human contact or the biting of mosquitoes to people. However, since we started using mosquito nets in the year 2000, about 20 years ago, the most used chemical is now undergoing what we call resistance, because the mosquitoes are becoming used to the chemicals. So they are changing their behaviors in different ways. They are changing how they respond to the chemicals. So I'll start by responding to the chemicals. Also, what's happening, the biology of the mosquitoes is changing, and that change makes sure that even if they are in contact with those chemicals, the mosquitoes still is able to resist and they are not dying. Secondly, the mosquitoes are changing their behaviors. During those years in 2000, the majority of mosquitoes in Malawi were those that were biting indoors. That's why mosquito nets were very useful. But now, with the passing of time, we have seen an increase in mosquitoes that are biting outdoors. In other words, if mosquitoes are biting outdoors, it means even if we are protected by mosquito nets, when we are sleeping, we are still exposed outside the houses. So that means mosquito nets could not 100% protect people. Even if anyone in the country is sleeping under a mosquito net, we will still have malaria. So we actually require other methods, what we call complementary methods, that could complement the mosquito bed nets. And this is actually going to help in the battle against malaria. So the challenges are there. Those are just some of the challenges, but there are indeed lots of them. We have what we call the residual transmission of malaria, whereby malaria has been transmitted mostly by mosquitoes that survive even after 100% implementation of mosquito nets or indoor residual spraying. So the residual, from the word residual, the remnant mosquitoes that actually avoid contact with those chemicals, they are still responsible for transmitting malaria.
Now, what would be the role of communities living in those areas and as far as reducing vector-borne diseases are concerned?
The communities, they do have a role to play, especially as far as vector-borne disease control is concerned. We recommend that in the communities, people should not only be using mosquito nets, for example. We recommend what we call integrated vector control management, whereby we use whatever method we can, whether it will be a mosquito net, whether it will be an insect repellent. Some people use their own initiative. They buy what we call repellents, whereby they can apply on their body, and those chemicals are able to repel away mosquitoes. We recommend them to at least have basic knowledge and understanding of mosquito. They should know the biology of a mosquito. They should know that mosquitoes, they breed in water. And by that knowledge, it means they will be able to protect their homes. Once they have water around their homes, they should be able to drain that water away. Perhaps they do have, for example, grasses around. We encourage them to make sure they cut the grasses, because what happens is mosquitoes not necessarily that they breed in the grasses, but the grasses help to keep the mosquitoes, because after they have fed, they have beaten people or animals, they move around and then they look for a place where they can rest. So if there are grasses around, that's where they will be resting. So once we clear that around, it means the mosquitoes will be far away from their homes. So we are working with the communities to help them to understand that, and to also make them aware that they have a responsibility to play. Not only should they rely on the government, but at their own, they can also make their own initiatives that they can assist them to control the spread of vector-borne diseases.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Health Outlook on Capital FM, the program that keeps you informed about health issues that matter most Malawians. Today, we are discussing vector-borne diseases with Kennedy Zembere from the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Research Program in Chikwawa. Just a reminder, this episode is part of our special series building up to World Mosquito Day on August 20th, a day to raise awareness about the dangers of mosquito-borne illnesses and the importance of research and prevention. Stay with us as we continue the conversation. Ngati mwangotsegula umene wairesi yanu, kumbukirani kuti mukumvera program ya Health Outlook pano pa Capital FM, ndipo mawa uno tikuyankhula ndi a Kennedy Zembere, mmodzi mwa akuluakulu amene amachita zakafukufuku okhuza udzudzu ku bungwe la Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Research Program.
Ma vector-borne diseases, kamena kuti ma vectors, tili ngati tizirombo ting'ono timene timayambisa matenda. Mwachisanzo tikhoza kamba za udzudzu. Udzudzu umatenga matenda ngati a malungo. Chokera kwa munthu ina amene ali ndi malungo, kenako kalumaso munthu ina kuti alibe malungo, umatha kukakatani ukampasira. Paokha udzudzu ukamabadwa umakhala kuti ulibe malungo. Ndeno kuno ku Malawi ndi mitundu ingapo ya udzudzu, koma kwambiri matenda ngati amene amayambika ndi tizirombo timene titama vectors alipo siyana monga malungo menda fotokozera, kuliso matenda ngati alikodzo amene amayambisidwaso ndi tizirombo. Tiziromboto timanyamulidwa ndi tinkhono tumene timapezeka m'madzi. So tinkhono tonso ndi chisanzo so chimodzi cha ma vectors chimene chimanyamula matenda ngati amenewa kapasira anthu ena. So ngati anthu akusambira m'madzi ndikuti akakumana ndi nkhonozo, komanso tizirombo timeneti amathanso kutenga matenda amenewa ndikuyamba kutani, ndikuyamba kudwala.
Anthu kuti makhala malo osiyanasiyana, kuti malo amenewa ali ndi kuthekera koyambisa matenda odza kamba ka tizirombo timeneti.
Malo amene timapezeka pamene pa chizungu timati environment aliso ndi kuthekera kwakulu kuthandizira kuti matenda amene azifalikira. Makamaka kupezeka kwa madziko, komanso kupezeka kwa kutentha, madera amene amatentha kwambiri ngati kuchikwawa kaya kumangochi, matenda ngati amenewa amakhalaso ochuluka. Komanso even madera ona kuti kaya ndi akuntunda, ona kuti kozizira, sikuti matenda amene sakhalako, koma amakhalako ngosiyana kuti mwina kachulukidwe kake kamakhala ndithu kusiyana inalako.
Ngati bungwe mwina muchitapo chani kuonetsetsa kuti mukuchepetsa kufala kwa tizirombo toyambisa matenda amenewa?
Ifeyo ngati Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Program tikuchita kafukufuku kuchikwawa amene tikuona kuchuluka kwa matenda ngati malungo, makamaka udzudzu umene umayambisa malungo, komanso tizirombo ngati nkhono timene timanyamula matenda alikodzo. Kwambiri tikuchita kafukufuku amene potsatira pa project yaikulu ya boma imene ikumangidwa makamaka ya makanala, imene izathandizire kwambiri ulimi wanthirira mtsogolomo. Project imene ndiyofunikira ndi abwino chifukwa izatithandiza kuti tizakhala ndi chakudya chokwanira, komanso anthu am'mudzi azikakhala zakudya zokwanira. Komano kafukufuku amene tikupanga tifuna tione kuti kodi kubwera kwa madzi amene wamukanala kuzathandizaso kuti matenda achuluke, chifukwa chona kuti madzi aja azapangisaso kuti udzudzu uzizayikira kwambiri. Kuzapangisa kuti udzudzu uzizayikira kwambiri, komanso kuzapangisa kuti mwina tinkhonoti tizachuluke. So tifuna tipeze njira zimene boma lingagwiritse ntchito, komanso anthu akumudzi angagwiritse ntchito kuti ngati zizakhale moteromo, pamene akuzapindula pa ulimi azapindulanso pa thanzi lawo kuti azizatha kuziteteza okha.
Mavuto anje amene mukumana nawo pamene mukugwira ntchito imeneyi?
Pamene tikugwira ntchito imeneyi yakafukufuku takumana ndi mavuto osiyanasiyana, makamaka pa nkhani yoziteteza ku matenda amenewa. Kuyambira mu chaka cha 2000 takhala tikugwiritsa ntchito maneti, koma maneti amenewa pakupita pa nthawi chifukwa kuti udzudzu wamba kumazolowera mankhwala amene amakhala maneti, wamba kupanga pa chizungu mati kupanga develop resistance, kamene kumazolowera ndeno zimene zipangisaso kuti mwina kupewa kwa malungo kwamene kuti tizirombo timene tikukhale kochepa. So tikuyenera tipeze njira zina zimene zingathandizire kuti anthu asamangogona muneti, azigona muneti inde, komanso azitha kuziteteza okha even nthawi yona kuti sakugona muneti. Mwina ni madzulo akugona, madzulo akucheza panja, kapena ena amakhala kugwira ntchito usiku. Nthawi imeneyo tipezeso njira zonna kuti azitha kuzitetezera. So zina zimene tikuchitaso ndi zimene zonso kuti at least ngati anthu azitha kuziteteza okha. Komanso kuphunzitsa anthu am'midzi kuti apeze njira zina zimene zingawathandizire kupewa matenda amenewa. Njira ngati for example mwina pakhomo ngati pali udzu kuchecha, pakhomo ngati pamezeka madzi mwina kumapanga drain kumachotsa, komanso azionesesa kuti pazikhala pa ukhondo chifukwa zonsezi zimathandiza kuti udzudzu uzichuluka. So anthu amudzi aja azizindikiranso ndi kudziwa kuti udzudzu umayikira m'madzi ndipo tizilombo ndimene timamba kukula kenako udzudzu uja umamba kutani kuuluka. So akakhala ndi kuthekera kumeneko upangiri umenewo ndi nzeru zimenezi zizawathandizira kuti nawonso pawokha azitha kuziteteza ku malungo. Potero ife tikatenga mbali ngati anthu akafukufuku, anthu amizinso kutenga mbali, bomanso kutengapo mbali zidzathandiza kuti nkhondo imeneyi tithe kukwanitsa kuyigonjetsa. Chifukwa chonena kuti boma lifunisa by 2030 kuti tidzakwanise kuthesa malungo ku Malawi kuno. Koma sizingatheke ngati tonse sitinagwirane dzanja.
Pameneponso mvera ndi pamapeto pa programu yathu ya Health Outlook pano pa Capital FM, ndipo mmawa uno tinali ndi Kennedy Zembere, mmodzi mwa akuluakulu amene amachita zakafufuko ku bungwe la Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Research Program. Zakhaleni pomponso sabata ya mawa pamene tizabwerenso ndi topic ina yokamba zambiri za umoyo. Munali ndine Catherine Tinto. Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of Health Outlook. A big thank you to our guest Kennedy Zembere from the Malawi Liverpool Wellcome Research Program for helping us understand more about vectors and the crucial role they play in public health. Join us next week for more insights and experts' discussions. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and take steps to protect yourself and your community from vector-borne diseases. I am Catherine Tinto, Keep It Capital.